This is not an album review. This is not a reaction video. This is me using music to understand myself better. If you don't agree with some of this, I won't hold it against you. I hope you return the favor.
It's been 22 long, hard years. I'm still struggling. Survival's got me bugging, but I'm alive on arrival.
So here's me going into my little spiel here.
Too many references to count. References everywhere. Talk shows, movies, stand-up, podcasts. Look, referencing Wu-Tang has become a shorthand for a specific set of cultural ideas. I think I've arrived at a point where I can recognize when the Wu-Tang Clan is being referenced, but not always what it implies. It feels like an in-joke I'm not in on. Which it is. That was the seed of my curiosity. Just my own insecurity about not being in on something everyone else knew. But decades went by without me analyzing even the few basic facts I had at hand. Because I'm super smart, apparently. What finally pushed me into it, to adding Wu-Tang to my list, was, oddly enough, the Marvel series on Netflix. After watching Daredevil, Jessica Jones, and Luke Cage, and enjoying all three, when they announced that Iron Fist was next a few years ago, and that the RZA would be directing, that's when the light bulb finally went off in my head. Oh, I get it now. The Wu-Tang Clan is a reference to martial arts films. Just exactly how dumb am I that it took me 2 decades to figure that out? And the more I thought about the superimposition of genre fiction and hardcore rap, the more sense it made, on both sides. I'll get into it more later, but I think it's fair to say that making that connection in my brain opened a lot of possibilities for me. Especially as here I am trying to train my ear into taking in music that, before now, I would have dismissed entirely. See, after I spent that time with Illmatic last year, my mind has been reorganizing itself. I've been asking myself some root-level existential questions about the nature of music. When I was young and first getting into music, I wanted to know how it worked. That's what I do. I want to know how stuff works. I learned to play guitar, and I taught myself how to play the music I liked. That was great, but that only answers the how, and not the why. So I started learning music theory. I studied composition. I practiced ear training. I got to where I could identify intervals, chords, harmonies, melodies, modes, time signatures, compositional form, almost as easily as I could identify colors and words. Then a few years ago, I was able to put voice to something that I think is a misconception for many folks that are intimidated by music theory. The thing is, music theory is not a set of rules for making music. Music theory is a framework for understanding music. Music does not exist because music theory exists because music. But there's a next step, and I never made that next step. The step I never made is I never stopped to realize that this gigantic collection of interrelated axioms does not have to be the only framework for understanding music. I never stopped to consider that the diatonic music theory that I've been studying for decades isn't universally applicable. In fact, what we study today as music theory was specifically designed to serve as an analysis framework for music created in the European musical tradition. And who says that there can't be other equally valid frameworks used for other kinds of music, just as there's traditional geometry and non-Euclidean geometry? Each has its application. And in the middle of grappling with this concept of multi-theoretical musical constructs, I found myself in an Uber for the first time in a long time. The driver was listening to the radio, and Jay-Z's Hard Knock Life came on. I'd never heard it before. And I found it more than a little amusing that there'd be a hip-hop tune using the soundtrack to Annie for its samples. I commented on that, and the driver told me it was actually a pretty old tune. I had to cop to my severe lack of knowledge when it comes to hip-hop, even though I'm a musician. He said, yeah, a good musician takes inspiration from everywhere. And that was so much like the thing that J-Mo said. It kind of floored me. I may have told this story before, but Butch, Mark, and J-Mo were doing a drum clinic at Mars Music here in Atlanta. I don't know, maybe 20, 25 years ago. Someone asked them about their influences. J-Mo's response was the best thing I'd ever heard. He said, everyone I've ever heard has influenced me, even if it's just to say, I don't want to sound like that. All these years later, I hear the same sentiment from my Uber driver. Yeah, it's time for me to learn to think about music in different ways. And so it's time to enter the Wu-Tang.
States my destination, handcuffed in the back of a bus. 40.
Growing up, I never really had any exposure to 90s rap or hip-hop. In fact, before this, I think I'd only heard one song by the Wu-Tang Clan, which is Cream, which is actually on this album, so I was pretty excited to jump into it, and let me briefly share my thoughts. I thought that the album had a very distinct sound and style, but I don't quite think it's a soundscape. A good comparison for me, I think, would be a lot of Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly. Wesley's Theory, namely, would be a really good example of a soundscape. So I don't think the Wu-Tang Clan quite accomplished that, but I don't think that was their goal to begin with. I saw a lot of song diversity in Enter the Wu-Tang, but it was still very much in their style, and to me that came across with simplistic beats. They got into this kind of specific groove that was pretty consistent throughout the whole album. They used lots of sampling.
3 things I noticed listening for the first time. First thing I noticed, the sound on this album is raw and it's pushed hard. On the last track, Wu-Tang 7th Chamber Part 2 Conclusion, the distortion on the bass line is super heavy. I actually like that sound a lot. Second was the cast of characters. It only took me a spin or two for me to be able to recognize Ghostface and Old Dirty Bastard immediately, for example. And finally, the thing I want to talk about is the beats, specifically their musical quality. There are a couple of tracks on this album where they allow the beats to play for a good long time after the raps are concluded. I mean, maybe they did that so other artists could loop them for their own work, or maybe just to highlight the RZA's production skills. Maybe just because they liked the way it sounded. Also, I noticed that the samples used for both Can It All Be So Simple and for Tears, they used 2 sets of samples for each, and each one was offset from the other by a half step. It adds this tension to what are otherwise more introspective, quieter tunes, especially at the end of each one where they start superimposing the 2 samples on top of each other. You get this really tense dissonance happening in the background. I don't think that was an accident. I think someone there's got some really good ears. Mostly what I'm noticing on this first spin is urgency. Not the sense of a need to find one's individuality in a hostile environment, which is common in most hardcore hip-hop, but a musical urgency. An almost impressionistic need to get something recorded while it still has an emotional edge. You know, trying to capture the light before it shifts.
Life is a short, shouldn't be so rough. But as the world turns.
What I learned from this album is that simple does not equal bad necessarily. You know, a lot of people, including myself, would think, you know, complex, more odd meter, more, you know, Dorian, whatever, more complex music theory equals better music, but that's just simply not the case. Something that I found really funny is that the talking interludes that would kind of be seen throughout the album really reminded me of the talking interludes in Outkast, their album Aquemini. That really big similarities, especially in the song Rosa Parks by Outkast.
Okay, look, I know before I say it how pretentious this is going to sound, but this is really the best contextualization I can come up with, so bear with me now. Here goes. This album is a mead hall boast. This album is epic poetry designed to take place in such a way that the speakers are the heroes of their own circumstance, to spin tales of their exploits and prowess, not to just inflate their own egos, but also to speak truth about their life. It's Beowulf. Enter the Wu-Tang, culturally, is Beowulf. And the truth of the matter is, this style of music has always served that role. It took me finally seeing the juxtaposition of hardcore hip-hop against kung fu movies to bring that to light. I mean, look, if you can see that Bob Dylan was not actually advocating hopping freight trains and living as a vagrant, and if you can see that Iron Maiden was not actually suggesting a life devoted to demonic possession, then it's not too much of a stretch to see that Wu-Tang Clan is using their reality, the reality of their circumstances, the reality of their surroundings to make themselves the heroes of their own story. It's what all good archetypal narrative works do. Since the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's the hero's journey. Now, having said all of that, my ears are still not completely at ease in this kind of environment. I mean, I'll have to make what I think is the crucial step of recognizing that this music cannot and should not be understood using a traditional diatonic music theory framework. That is, I've got to develop a new language, a new set of ears for listening to this kind of music. But the fact remains that I'm still at square one when it comes to understanding hip-hop on its own terms. I think that'll change, though.
Overall, it may not be my first choice of music if I were handed the aux, but I still really, really appreciate the music.
Yes, I guess that's the time when I'm not depressed. But I'm still depressed and I ask, what's it worth? Ready to give up, so I seek the old earth. Who explains?